Learning Path 2, Implement Azure Functions. In this learning path, you will learn a couple of modules. One is about exploring the Azure Functions and the other one is to develop Azure Functions. And the module 1, Explore Azure Functions. The objectives in here is to find a difference between an Azure function and a logic app and a web job. We will also describe the Azure Functions hosting plans. We will learn about how you can deal with scalability with the Azure Functions to meet your business needs. Now, what is an Azure Serverless function? A piece of code that you can write using Python or C# where it can run for you based on an event that is your function. For example, take an e-commerce application where every time my customer comes to my application and he or she downloads the invoice, I can write a piece of code where his request to download the invoice is the HTTP trigger. So whenever this happens, the piece of code, which is my function, will run, which will create an invoice by fetching the records related to his transaction and make him to download the invoice. Now I can keep this piece of code in my application. What happens now? If 1 million customers try to download an invoice, you are going to allocate the CPU core and the RAM of your server for all the 1 million requests. This is where when you go for function, here, every time when a customer request comes, it could be 1 or 1 million, an automatic allocation of CPU core and RAM will take place automatically, which means it's 1 user or 1 million user based off number of requests and process you make. You pay for that. So there is no unwanted time and money you spend from the CPU core and RAM of your ongoing production server. So this is what a function is. So making it simple, a serverless piece of code that works on an event for a business case you have that can help you to do auto scaling with a cheaper pricing tier. That is your Azure function. Now regarding an Azure function can integrate with various options. That's why we call it as an integration service. And as I said, it's an event driven. A function can connect to notification hubs in Azure, event grids, event hubs, Cosmos DB, Twilio, which is a messaging service, service bus queues and topics, Azure queues, blobs, or table storage. For all of these, a function can easily communicate with. To talk more in detail, I give an example. Let us say there is an event saying that a picture is uploaded to Azure blob storage. So that could be an event grid data, which can trigger a function that can create a GIF image based out of 10 pictures that are in an event grid and give that as an output to blob storage. So this means an input, process that input using a code in the function and deliver that process data as an output to an output binding. So these inputs and outputs are what you can call it as bindings. So these functions can run on an event on a time schedule, can also be triggered using certain HTTP calls and different choices that you talk about. Now regarding Azure function versus logic app, an Azure function is a developer component where you write the code to implement a business logic. And a logic app are based out of predefined connectors. Plenty of connectors are readily available. You take them, you connect from one to another, which makes an automation process. So that means for non-developers and for RPA purpose, logic apps are best options. Connectivity for a function, you can use bindings, which means you write a piece of code and you make services to connect to a function. But in a logic app, you have enterprise integration connectors, B2B connectors, you have plenty of available package of actions available using which you make connections to services. In function, every activity you have to perform is a piece of code. So you write the code to do an activity. But in a logic app, you make use of something called actions, which is a collection of different activities that do a business case for you. Similarly, to monitor a function, I can make use of the Azure Application Insights, and Azure Application Insights is a developer monitoring feature that you can make use of. Similarly, you have this facility, which is your logic app that can be monitored from the Azure portal or from the logic apps in the Azure. The logic apps of Azure portal can also be monitored using the logs available in Azure Monitor. Similarly, you talk about the management. I can use REST APIs. I can also use Visual Studio for the purpose of the process of managing and monitoring my function in terms of management. Similarly, for Logic App, you can use Azure Portals, REST APIs, PowerShell scripts, or even a Visual Studio Code. You talk about the execution, you can run a function locally in your laptop as well. All you need is just to download and install the respective SDK, or you can run a function in cloud. But a Logic App cannot run anywhere. It's like it should basically run in the cloud. The thing is like it's requiring a runtime environment, which is mostly given by cloud, in which you get this done. Comparing a function with web jobs is another case. So what is a web job? A piece of code that runs within a web server is a web job based on the events you have. But there are some differences. To see that, function is serverless, which has built-in auto-scaling, but a web job is not a built-in auto-scalable feature, which makes a difference. Second thing, a function can be developed within a browser. You can do testing and everything in a browser, but a web job does not work like that. You pay for what you do in a function, but web job, it's not that way. You pay for the server in which it runs as a job. Integration with logic apps is possible for function, but web jobs cannot do that. And the events that can be triggered. So when you talk about function, a timer trigger, a storage queue and a blob trigger, service bus queues and topics trigger, Cosmos DB and event hub trigger, these are all available in both web jobs and functions. But when you come to web jobs, you have file system trigger. Similarly, in function, you have HTTP and webhook based triggers and event grid triggers. So if you see, very simple answer is web job is a job that runs on a server where your application is, but a function is completely independent, which can run a job for you based on your needs to scale for very large capacity. Comparing the functions hosting tier. So there are three hosting plans. One is consumption plan. So you run a job for 10 seconds or 1 minute or 1 day, you pay for that. That's consumption plan, which is pay as you use. Premium plan, in which you get a dedicated premium server that has highest scalable capacity. So you, regardless run a function or not, you create a plan, you pay money for it. Similarly, dedicated plan, which is your app service plan, the same pricing tier options which we discussed in the previous learning lesson, which is Azure app service plan, the same can be used here as well. Similarly, you can also use app service environment. Just in case you want to run a function on a dedicated virtual network, you can use app service environment. Then you have Kubernetes. So Azure Kubernetes cluster can also be used by you. And that's a scenario where AKS is an option to run your functions, which is also possible with an isolation. Now coming to the hosting plan, which is dedicated plan. So in this one, you can do scaling for the function using auto scaling. Similarly, you can run multiple functions in a function app. That's common. But the thing is, here you can do scaling similar to the web app. So your functions will share the capacity. And you can bring virtual network integration and all, which makes a slight difference. Now, regarding the Azure function hosting options, you have consumption plan, I told you, which is the default hosting option. So auto scaling will happen based on number of requests you get. So you pay for number of transactions you perform. So your Azure function will add and remove the virtual machines for you based on incoming events and requests that it receives per second. Premium plan, you get premium servers that are faster in deployment, can run powerful jobs for you on top of integration with virtual network. And a dedicated plan is your app service plan. Similar to app service, you pay money for it. And this is very much suitable for scenarios where you want to run a function in a fixed cost per month in a durable way, where one function can call some other function, which is called durable function. That scenarios, it's good to use a dedicated pricing tier. Now regarding function hosting options, an Azure function app will have timeout duration. So that's your timeout property that can be found in a host.json file of a function project you create. So a timeout can be useful to specify how long a job can run, and usually can go up to 1 hour depending on the pricing tiers. So for example, when I go for a consumption plan, the default timeout is like 5 minutes, and maximum a consumption plan can run a job for 10 minutes. That is a limit. You go for a premium or dedicated plan, the default timeout is 30, and maximum duration, you can run a job for longer duration, but as a best practice, running a job no more than 1 hour is a good thing, because as you run it for longer time, there are alternative services called Azure batch jobs that can be used for this case. Now, when you run a function in the Azure platform, you need something called storage account. Why? I told you a function is a stateless one. So when a job is over, the CPU core and RAM may be not used. At that time, the logic of the code and any files or configurations you kept, they should be kept somewhere. So any plan or function you use, it's necessary that you create a general purpose storage account. And followed by that, your Azure functions, whenever they run, they will use your storage account to make use of any triggers that you configure for it, or to keep log files and execution runtime. For all the cases, it is going to be an important option. Now, talking about scalability in Azure functions, in Azure function, the unit of scalability is going to be based out of the function. To talk about it, there is something called scale controller. So a scale controller is going to constantly monitor and determine when to scale out or scale in the number of instances of server you get for a function app. So when you talk about scale in here, what happens is that when there is no job happening, there could be even zero servers, which means no servers available for a function to work. In this scenario, after this complete zero downtime, or in other words, zero servers came to the picture, later when a new request comes, it becomes a cold start, which means there could be a slight latency for the first request to be completely processed, because it should bring on a new server based on your demand in such a case. Now, regarding scaling of function, the scaling behaviors goes in different ways based on different pricing tiers and languages that you select. For example, maximum number of instances you talk about, a single function app, it can scale to a maximum of 200 instances, which are our 200 virtual machines. And in a scenario where if you want to have a single instance, the thing is you can process multiple messages and requests at the same time in a function app. And now here, when we talk about this limitation part, if you want to set, it is possible. So if you like to keep a limitation that maximum scaling doesn't or shouldn't go more than specific number, you can also set that limit. So you talk about new instance creation. For a HTTP trigger, usually a new instance is mostly allocated like once in every second. But for any non-HTTP trigger, like an event trigger, which is like a blob storage or event grid or event hub, in those cases, every 30 seconds, the trigger is going to happen in a way such that a new instance gets created once in 30 seconds, which is a difference, which means HTTP triggered scalability could be more faster. You talk about scaling of Azure functions. You have limit scale out. What is that? So I told you a function can scale based on the demand you have, but sometimes the database that is connected to a function is having a limit. Like a function can process 10,000 requests per second, but a DB is throttling not more than 5,000 requests it can handle. In that case, to handle this bottleneck, you can limit scale out, where in the facility where you can set this function app scale limit, which is a very environmental variable, to the restriction that you need, so that it can help your app not to scale more than a specific limitation, so that you cannot ensure that, you can ensure that your throttling doesn't go more than a specific value. So talking about scaling in a dedicated plan, you know that by setting an auto scaling rule, you can easily control the facilitation of scalability in a dedicated plan here. As a summary, in this module, you learned about the difference between a function app, logic app, and a web job. You did learn about the hosting plan options. We did discuss about how you can use a function app to meet your different business needs. Followed by that, you have a knowledge check. You do check out those to understand your learning so far.